We stepped out onto the deserted street, bathed in the blinding sun. The air, fresh and clean, smelled faintly of grass. Along the mangled asphalt stretched a carpet of late dandelions and unfamiliar bluish flowers. Finn and I staggered from thirst. Grey 5-story buildings with empty windows stood like a wall, as if trying to block our path. In the distance, 9-story blocks loomed. Their peeling balconies gaped like broken teeth. Some signs still had street names, but the alphabet was unfamiliar to us. Finn silently pointed to an intersection where 4 equally lifeless streets diverged. In the distance, a square with a dark monument could be seen, probably the center of the district. We trudged in that direction, trying not to waste our last strength. But after a few steps, I noticed fences of private houses appearing to the right, between the grey buildings. Several apple trees, weary from the weight of their fruit, pushed through the fences, drawing attention. Without hesitation, we headed there. Bees buzzed in the grass, and the wind carried the scent of rotten, fallen apples. We couldn't resist, and greedily plucked ripe apples from the branches. The taste was sour, but at that moment it was exactly what we needed. We ate in silence, feeling hunger and thirst recede. My gaze drifted over a small, dilapidated fence. A gate was about 3 meters away. Finn tried to open the latch, but time had welded it shut. No big deal. We easily hopped over it and found ourselves in a weed-choked yard. In the middle stood a house, small with a low roof. The doors and windows were boarded up, but everything looked intact. A few meters from the house stood a shed, its door slightly ajar. We peered inside. It was dark and dusty, the air heavy with the smell of dampness. Old tools stood in the corner. Rusty crowbars, pickaxes, axes, and garden implements. I grabbed one of the crowbars and nodded to Finn. "This will do," I said. Finn took the axe, and we headed towards the house. We went to the boarded-up door, where planks were nailed to the old wooden frame. I inserted the crowbar into the gap between the planks, and with effort pulled out one of the nails. Getting the hang of the tool, we pried out the remaining nails. Another couple of minutes were spent knocking off a padlock. The door creaked open, and we went inside. Weak light penetrated inside, cutting through the darkness and illuminating a dusty floor and fairly sturdy furniture. A stove stood in the corner. A dust-covered kerosene lamp sat on the table. I lit it, and a dim light illuminated the room. We began to look around. Not far from the stove, I noticed a hatch in the floor. Kneeling down, I tried to pull the ring, but the lid was stuck fast. Then the crowbar and axe came to the rescue. Shining the light into the cellar, we saw shelves along the walls, lined with jars. I remembered how my grandmother used to make such preserves from vegetables and fruits. Descending the sturdy stairs, we examined the contents. Unfortunately, such preserves don't last long, especially not 20 years, but we were lucky. 2 boxes of canned goods stood in the corner. Judging by the faded picture of a cow and a pig, it was stew. And that, as far as I know, can last half a century. We quickly gathered several cans and tossed them into our bags. It was what we needed to hold us over for a while. Closing the hatch, we continued to explore the house, looking for any other supplies or things that might be useful. We rummaged through cupboards, peered into drawers and sideboards. In some places the wood was swollen from time, but everything still opened. In one corner stood a bag of rice. You only had to touch it for it to crumble into dust, as if rotten from the inside. The pasta in an open package had been eaten by bugs. Only dust and a grey coating remained. But deep in the sideboard, I felt a heavy jar. A 3-liter one with a yellowed label, and inside, amber honey. The lid was tight, not dented, and everything inside looked clean. Finn found a tin box of tea, also an old jar with petrified salt. We laid out all the edible items on the table. Not much, but enough to survive. "Need water," Finn muttered, turning the tap over the sink. A dull groan came from the depths of the pipe, as if a rusty beast was yawning down below. Then silence, not a drop. "Well, at least no rust came out," I chuckled. "Let's go to the yard," Finn said. "Maybe there's a well here." Instead of a well, a little to the side of the house, a rusty metal pump with a long handle stood in the weeds. "Oh, retro," I said. "Just need to check if it pumps, or just rips our arms off," Finn grumbled and grabbed the handle. He yanked it a couple of times. The handle creaked but moved stiffly. The pump didn't respond. "Empty," he said. "A dry pump doesn't pump. You need to prime it with water first." "And we don't have any, as luck would have it." I looked around. We walked around the house, and in the shade, under a rusted gutter, we found a tank. Old metal sunk into the ground, covered with a lopsided wooden lid. Everything around it was overgrown with grass and moss, but the gutter above was intact, meaning the tank still collected water when it rained. I lifted the lid. Murky green water sloshed inside. Not much, but enough to prime the pump. I went back to the kitchen and took an old enamel ladle. The water smelled of iron and wet leaves. Finn poured some into the priming hole of the pump, waited a couple of seconds, and started pumping again. The handle moved more smoothly. A creak, a gurgle, and finally, a hoarse, sputtering stream burst from the spout. "Yes," I exhaled. "Been silent for 20 years, and now it's talking." Finn grinned. We quickly agreed that Finn would stay here to explore the neighboring houses for food, medicine, and possibly ways to boil water. And I had to hurry back to my poor Liv and Deck. More than an hour had passed since we left our overnight shelter. I tossed a couple of cans of stew, apples, and poured water into an old liter flask. Our plan was this. I'd return here with the others, as this place seemed much safer, and we'd stay here until Liv and Deck recovered. I stepped out onto the familiar street and broke into a run. No birds, no cars, no wind, like in a forgotten container in the middle of the desert, only the rush of blood in my ears. About 10 minutes later, I was already running into the building entrance. 5 flights, and the one and only door. I banged my fist on it. "Deck, it's me! Open up!" Hurried footsteps sounded from behind the door. "Mate, 1 sec, just moving the wardrobe," he replied. There was a scraping sound, a grunt. The wardrobe wasn't easy to move alone. Finally, a pale Deck appeared in the doorway. "Here, take some apples," I tossed him the bag. "And I'm going to live." With the flask of water, I went straight to the bedroom. My girl lay curled up in a fetal position. She was shivering. She wasn't asleep, but her eyes were closed, as if she didn't even have the strength to open them. "Liv, water," I whispered, sitting down beside her. Liv took a couple of sips, and strength left her again. Deck brought the opened stew, and while we ate, I told them about the private sector. According to our and Finn's estimates, the dead didn't reach there. In any case, everything looked intact, with supplies of food and water, so we needed to move there. Deck suggested making a stretcher. In principle, I could carry Liv in my arms, but she was too weak to even hold onto my neck. We started figuring out what we could use to make a stretcher. A hollow core plywood door from between the rooms was the best option. Light, pliable, but it held its shape. We took it off its hinges and dragged it into the hallway. In the children's room, I pulled a thin mattress off the bed and threw it on top. It turned out quite decent. Carefully, I transferred Liv onto our makeshift contraption. She barely reacted, only breathing faintly. Before leaving, we still locked the apartment, just in case we needed it again. We walked slowly because Deck was also weakened. He went ahead, and I followed behind. Liv barely moved, only occasionally wincing as if in a dream. The sun was high, melting the concrete and asphalt. My gaze fell on Liv's leg. Her jeans leg had ridden up a bit, and on her ankle just above her sock. I saw that the skin was swollen, pink, with a cloudy blister in the center. It hadn't been there yesterday. Strange. Finally, after about 30 minutes, we reached the house. Finn wasn't there. We carried Liv into the bedroom. The bedroom turned out to be spacious. High ceilings, parquet flooring, a massive oak bed. 2 huge dark wood wardrobes stood in the corner. I held up the kerosene lamp and the wavering light picked out stacks of bedding on the shelves. Starched but yellowed sheets, duvet covers with embroidered initials. Everything smelled of time, but was impeccably clean. I made the bed, trying not to stir up dust. Liv barely reacted when I transferred her from the stretcher. I gently undressed her and covered her with a thick wadded blanket. Deck, meanwhile, was searching the house, his footsteps echoing dully in the neighboring rooms. I went out into the yard, took a cigarette from the crumpled pack and lit it. My thoughts revolved around one thing: how to boil water for Liv. Unexpectedly, Finn's face popped out from behind the neighboring fence. "Already here?" He scanned the yard with a quick glance. "How are our patients?" Deck's on his feet, but Liv, I took a drag, squinting from the smoke. Temperatures over 40. Some nasty things appeared on her leg. Infection, I reckon. Finn tossed a battered sports bag over the fence and nimbly vaulted over himself. Found some stuff in the next house. He unzipped the bag, taking out several plastic bottles with a cloudy liquid. Moonshine, about 70 proof. Perfect for disinfecting. I nodded, finishing my cigarette. And how are we going to boil water? Already figured it out. Finn pointed his thumb towards the shed. Bricks and coal there, enough to build a factory. We'll have boiling water in half an hour. Finn stayed to stack the bricks into a makeshift hearth. I hurried back to Liv, taking the kerosene lamp with me. It was stuffy in the bedroom. It smelled of dust and sweat. Liv tossed and turned in a semi-sleep, the sheet twisted around her legs. I took a clean one from the wardrobe and tore it into strips for bandages. The moonshine hit my nose with a sharp chemical note. Liv moaned when the alcohol touched the wound. Red streaks were already showing on her ankle. The bandages went on tight, instantly soaking up sweat. Deck sat at the kitchen table, propping his head with his hand. I placed a bottle in front of him. "Drink this and go get some sleep. It hurts to look at you." He slowly raised his gaze. "Yeah, I'm all right. Don't be a hero. We might be running again tonight." He waved his hand, took a sip, and grimacing shuffled into the next room. When I went out into the yard, Finn was already fanning the coals. He wiped soot from his hands on his jeans, glancing at the house. "How are they in there?" "Liv's bad, and Deck's a bit listless too. I reckon he's starting to get a fever as well. We need antibiotics, otherwise I don't know how this will end." Finn pulled out his phone. "Fair's just gone too, still some daylight left. I'll scout out the center, there's got to be pharmacies here, and I'll check some apartments. Only thing is, I don't know much about meds, but hopefully I can find something. You keep an eye on them." "Finn, be careful. We have no idea what this place is or what happened here. Take my phone. I downloaded an offline translator a while back. Should help. Just conserve the battery. There's 45% charge left." Finn slung the battered sports bag with unfamiliar letters over his shoulder, grabbed a small hatchet and a knife, and set off. I put the enamel bucket on the makeshift hearth to heat water and went to check on the others. It was quiet in the house. Liv was delirious in her sleep, and Deck lay staring at the ceiling. "How are you feeling?" I asked. "Like a dead cat," he mumbled, "but still alive for now." I poured him some water and told him that Finn had gone to the center to scout. All that was left was to wait. Several hours passed. The sun was leaning towards the horizon, but it was getting dark too quickly, unnaturally, as if someone was in a hurry to plunge the world into night. I moved from room to room looking after the others, who were getting worse. My eyelids felt like lead. The sleepless night and this stuffy house were slowly draining my strength. I leaned against Liv's bed and fell into a heavy, restless sleep. I woke up to a distant roar. The door swung open. An excited Finn stood on the threshold. "Did you find anything?" I asked worriedly. Finn emptied the contents of the bag onto the table. Blister packs of tablets. The plastic yellowed on some, the foil bubbled up on others, ampules with sediment, tubes of effervescent tablets, tubes of ointments with cracked sides, boxes of powders in individual packets, bottles of drops and syrups, some cloudy, some already with mold around the neck, several packs of syringes. We quickly started reading the names, but unfortunately, they didn't tell us anything. I remembered that Deck's mother was a doctor and hurried to his room. "Deck, we have a ton of medicine, but we have no idea which ones are antibiotics. Do you happen to know how to identify them?" I asked. Deck struggled to sit up and, on wobbly legs, went into the kitchen. "I know the most famous antibiotic is penicillin, so we need to look for anything in the name that ends in "cillin." That'll be 100% penicillin series. Without much difficulty, we found several boxes of ampules with suitable names. True, everything had long expired, but there was no choice. We could only hope that something was preserved in the sealed ampules. None of us had ever given injections, but Deck theoretically knew how it was done. "Good thing you grabbed glass syringes," he mumbled, sifting through the medical junk. These plastic disposable ones would have crumbled in 20 years. Half of them have cracked plungers. But these, they're as good as new. Probably made back in the 40s. He opened one ampule. Something was floating inside. Cloudy with sediment. Deck squinted. There's probably nothing left here. But if even part of the molecules is still active, there's a chance. He broke open a second ampule, then a third. After 20 years, the active ingredient breaks down, especially if it was stored just anywhere, at the wrong temperature without light. I can't check it, but by eye, well, let's say maybe 2% is left. So we need to increase the dose. He opened a fifth ampule, drawing all the contents into the glass syringe. Too much is dangerous, too little is useless. But in our case, it's a shot in the dark. He splashed moonshine on Liv's buttock, chose a spot, and despite the tremor in his hands, inserted the needle quickly and cleanly. You could see him clench his teeth, not from fear, but to stay on his feet. That's it. Now we wait, he said, straightened up, and immediately staggered. I caught him by the arm. How about you? I asked. Deck exhaled heavily, pulled up his sleeve. On his shoulder, an uneven, inflamed patch, with a dull center and reddened edges. The skin around it was taut like fabric under pressure. Got this, he grumbled. Thought it would pass in, but it looks like it's festering. Does it hurt? Not painful, just itchy. That's even worse, means it's gone deeper. I need an antibiotic too. We returned to the kitchen. He filled a second syringe. His movements became a little slower. You could see his strength was waning. Guys, help me get my jeans off. I'll inject it into my thigh. We exchanged glances. I unzipped his fly. Finn grabbed his belt. We pulled them down to mid-thigh, just enough to allow access. That's the ticket, Deck mumbled. He wiped his skin with moonshine, checked the syringe, tapping it lightly with his fingernail. He injected it quickly and deeply, exhaling when he pulled out the needle. That's it. Help me get to the cot. In the distance, a muffled groan and roar could be heard. Finn and I exchanged glances and silently headed for the door. The door was solid with a massive frame. We locked it with a heavy bolt and pushed the sofa tightly against it, old, bulky, with a wooden frame. We laid out everything we could use to defend ourselves on the table. Earlier, I had dragged pitchforks, a shovel, a couple of reinforcing bars, a piece of metal pipe, a rusty pry bar, and a cast-iron iron from the shed. We fashioned Molotov cocktails from the moonshine bottles. Knives, a hammer, everything at the ready. We sat by the kerosene lamp. The light was dim, reddish, like from a fire in a metal barrel. The tea had cooled, but we drank it with honey anyway. It gave us strength. Finn looked exhausted. He hadn't slept for almost 2 days. What this night would bring, no one knew. From outside, groans could be heard from time to time, dull and drawn out. But we felt like we were in a safe zone. For now. Finn told us about his foray into the town. It turned out we were in Devnya, some abandoned Bulgarian town. He had held my offline translator up to everything. Signs, door signs, pieces of old newspapers, even a memorial plaque by the ruined town hall. Something happened here in 2003. The translator couldn't quite make out what it was. Only fragments. From the fragments, it followed that a huge chemical plant had been closed down that year. They wrote about a crisis, about a temporary evacuation, and some kind of incident on the territory of Devnya Kim. A newspaper in a shop window reported that the school was closed indefinitely. On the door of a pharmacy was a note, temporarily closed. All the dates were 2003, nothing after that. Everything looked as if the residents had left in a hurry. Or maybe they hadn't left. Maybe they were the ones returning at night. But that wasn't the most important thing. While he was rummaging through the pharmacy, collecting everything that even remotely resembled medicine, a car drove by. A real one, with headlights, with the hum of an engine. He froze. Then he rushed outside. The car was already turning the corner. He ran, as much as he could, along the cracked asphalt through the overgrown yard, but he didn't catch up. He dashed into the neighboring 9-story building, gasping for breath. More than a day without sleep, was enough for his body to feel every step. He reached the 9th floor, walked through the dark corridors, and went out onto the balcony of one of the apartments. From there, almost everything was visible, several blocks, but the car was gone. He looked around the empty street. No tracks, no one. Just an abandoned city. The night passed relatively calmly, as much as possible in our situation. Finn and I sat on the sofa, pushed against the door. We discussed for a long time what to do next and decided to try to find that car in the morning. At some point, Finn passed out. I also nodded off from time to time, but every distant, indistinct sound from the street immediately brought me back to reality. I would get up and go check on Liv and Dec. It seemed the medicine was working. Liv's breathing had evened out. She lay peacefully, her forehead was cool. The fever had subsided. Dec was also asleep. There was no more fever. This was a little reassuring. In the morning, Dec woke us up. He was still pale, but stood in the doorway, leaning against the jamb, quite confidently. "Wouldn't mind a coffee right now?" he said dreamily, looking somewhere into the depths of the house, as if that's where the coffee could be found. "Oh, mate, how are you feeling?" Finn got up, stretched, and yawning, slapped his chest. "Actually, not bad. The antibiotic seems to have worked. Should probably repeat the injection for good measure." He spoke in an almost normal voice now, without wheezing, without gasping for breath. I went to check on Liv. She had just sat up on the edge of the bed, holding on to the bedside table. "How are you?" I asked. "Better, much better. Head's clear, body doesn't ache, just still weak." We boiled water, made strong black tea, added a little honey. We discussed plans for the day. Finn and I would scout, see where the car might have come from, whether there were any tracks. Dec and Liv would stay to recover. The town greeted us with silence. If in the private sector where we settled at least bees were buzzing, here there was no sound. Even the birds didn't seem to fly here. I once read that if bees disappear, it means the world is coming to an end soon. But there were bees here, so not all was lost. We went out to a street with abandoned 5-story buildings. It adjoined the area where we had spent the night. And we immediately understood. The dead had been here at night. There were definitely no traces of them here yesterday. A leg lay on the sidewalk at the intersection, below the knee blackened with shreds of muscle. A greasy trail stretched from it, as if someone had crawled, smearing rotting flesh behind them. In the playground, right on a swing, someone had left a scalp, thin, sticky skin with hair stuck to it. So they had been very close, but they hadn't reached us. The center of Devnya looked as if people hadn't left in a panic, but simply hadn't returned from their lunch break. Everything was in its place, neat but lifeless. A cultural center with wide open glass doors, behind which now only darkness, crumbling stucco and suspended dust remained. A thick layer of rotten leaves lay on the marble steps, in the cracks of the slabs, the roots of weeds that had broken through the stone and swollen with time. The glass was fogged up, and ivy leaves, reaching for the silence but not daring to enter, were imprinted on it. A phone booth stood as if alive, whole, without a single crack. Only the cobweb between the receiver and the wall indicated that no one had been here for a long time. The asphalt was cracked not by tires but by roots. Roads, courtyards, balconies, everything was swallowed by greenery. It had come to replace people and grew as it pleased, without restrictions and without demand. The streetlights stood silently, as if waiting for a night that would never come. The roadsides were covered with dry pine needles, as if someone had carefully poured out bags of the past. There were no broken windows, kicked-in doors, or signs of intrusion anywhere. Everything had been left, untouched, as in a sealed dream. In the center of the square stood a monument, a man in a long coat, or maybe a military uniform. We passed a large store, a building with wide windows, a faded sign, and branches intertwined in the display window. A little further on, we saw a building with columns. At first, we thought it might be a theater. We approached. The massive oak door didn't give way immediately. It creaked. Inside was a spacious marble hall, dusty, echoing, with doors wide open to rooms filled with bookshelves. It was a library. We entered one of the reading rooms. A spacious room with high ceilings, long tables, green lamps on them. Light through the large windows flooded the hall, warm, a little dim, but cozy. The smell of old paper hung in the air, but everything felt alive, despite the long abandonment. We went to the bookshelves and came across a section with periodicals. Old magazines and newspapers lay neatly in drawers and on shelves, yellowed and worn by time. Just what we needed. We went to the shelf with newspapers and magazines from 2003. The last issue was dated May of that year. There was nothing after that. May 2003, the last month when the city was still alive. I took a picture of one of the pages and turned on the offline translator. After a couple of seconds, the translation was ready. We began to study the information, trying to understand what had happened in the city in recent weeks. The information in the newspapers was frightening. In May 2003, something happened at the chemical plant. An accident or a leak, the details were not given. All residents of the city were urged to evacuate. The publication stated that the evacuation was organized through several points and that there was no need to take many things, only the essentials. It was supposed to be temporary. They promised that it would be possible to return in a couple of weeks. All this was written with such confidence, as if people should take it as something ordinary, as a standard procedure. No one expected that this whole situation would be the beginning of the end. In the far corner of the library, behind the local history section, we found a stand with maps. Most were general, without details, but one old city plan with yellowed folds of paper turned out to be useful. Not only streets were marked on it, but also industrial zones. In the northwestern outskirts of Devnya, a large grey area marked Agropolikim. A railway line stretched from it to the port. Warehouses and something like a cargo terminal were indicated nearby. There were almost no open fields, a dense grid of roads and auxiliary buildings. It was no more than 3 kilometers to the city center. We took the map and went out to the square. We decided to check the store we had passed earlier first. We tried to open the doors, heavy glass ones, but they wouldn't budge. It looked like someone had locked them from the inside. Okay. We turned back towards the road that, according to the map, led from the city to the industrial zone. After walking a couple of blocks, we noticed a small store at an intersection. It looked modest, but intact. We peered inside, hoping to find at least something edible. We had a few apples left, but we wanted to find something more nutritious. On the store shelves lay items that had turned to stone and dust. We walked along them, but found nothing that could be called food. However, in one of the sections, we discovered several shelves with stew, the same kind we had found in the cellar of the house. Apparently, only the stew had managed to survive the time. We took a couple of cans. In a small alcohol section, the picture was much more pleasant. Dust-covered bottles suggested that the contents were quite well preserved. We grabbed a few bottles. Judging by the shape, it was whiskey and vodka. We followed the map towards the edge of the city. On either side were rows of 5- and 9-story buildings, typical grey with peeling facades in places. The courtyards were built as if copied. Swings, slides, carousels, everything was overgrown. Bus stops occasionally appeared. From the residential area, we emerged onto a wider street. On the corner was a school with a closed yard and sports ground. The asphalt cracked, weeds along the edges. Further on, after a block, we encountered a kindergarten, 1 story, with faded panels and small canopies in the yard. After a couple of streets, the administrative part. Among the square buildings, we recognized the bus station, and next to it, a bus depot. Dozens of old buses stood behind the fence, rusty with flat tires. They were lined up in even rows as if waiting their turn, but long forgotten. In the center of this block was an old cinema, dusty display windows, faded posters behind the glass, a ticket booth. A little further on, a stadium and a solitary sports ground with bent hoops. The city wasn't destroyed. It had simply withdrawn into itself, as if it had frozen and not woken up. Beyond the last 9-story buildings began the private sector. Scattered houses with fences, old gates, overgrown gardens. The asphalt faded away, turning into uneven, trodden earth. Everything looked as if people had left for the summer and forgotten to return. The windows were intact, the curtains faded, empty pots on the windowsills. Apple trees, grapevines, pomegranates, and here and there fig trees grew in the plots. The fruits hung heavily and slowly fell to the ground, right in the yards. The streets meandered between the yards, leading downhill. Somewhere ahead on the horizon, Port cranes were already visible. Further on, beyond a river or bay, massive structures of the industrial zone rose. Pipes, blank buildings, tanks, and storage blocks. An old road led towards them, with potholes cracked in places, with peeling signs. Dilapidated buildings, garages, empty hangars appeared on the left. The city didn't end abruptly but seemed to dissolve, transitioning into this wide, dusty, as if exhausted space on the outskirts of the plant. To the right, a wide cornfield opened up, dense, green, taller than a person. It looked strangely alive against everything else, as if someone had recently taken care of it. It stretched to the very horizon, even as a carpet, and looked incongruously well maintained. No traces of machinery, no paths, no weeds, just a wall of standing corn, dense rustling in the wind. Something alive but not friendly emanated from it. We stood rooted to the spot. The cornfield was frightening. It was about half a kilometer to the factories, and we really didn't want to walk along the road where we were in plain sight. By the way, the road, a track clearly stood out on it, showing that it was often used. Tire tracks were sharply etched in the dust. So this is where those whom Finn had seen in the city yesterday were based. After a brief consultation, we decided not to risk it and to think everything over. We turned back and went in search of a house. The sun pierced the foliage, painting ragged shadows on the yellowed grass. We settled in the shade of a sprawling oak tree in someone's former beautiful garden. The abandoned house on the hill was chosen not by chance. From here, like in the palm of our hand, both the gloomy buildings of the plant and the winding road leading to it were visible. Our stomachs rumbled demandingly. A short break was necessary to refuel and gather our thoughts. It turned out that the cans we had taken from the store contained not just stew, but a very hearty and tasty porridge with meat. Our eyes, however, remained fixed on the plant, the object of our attention. The unknown pressed down on us. How many souls were there now beyond its walls? And what were their intentions in this God-forsaken place on the Bulgarian coast? A logical question arose. What to do next? Rush out to meet them, relying on luck and a willingness to negotiate? Or exercise caution, first studying the situation? But time was running out. Waiting for darkness promised nothing good. The sprawling cornfield nearby evoked an unpleasant premonition, although to our relief no obvious signs of the dead had yet been observed in the vicinity. A decision had to be made quickly: reconnaissance or open confrontation. What would bring less risk and a greater chance of survival? The landscape flickered, and in the distance, a murky cloud of dust billowed, slowly approaching. After several agonizing minutes, the silhouette of a car emerged from this haze, moving directly towards our shelter. Our breath caught in our throats. There it was, the car. Its contours became clearer and clearer. Inside, figures were visible. 3 people clad in white suits, strangely reminiscent of hazmat suits. Suddenly, metal glinted in one of the windows, the barrel of an automatic rifle. The tension reached its limit. But the car, without slowing down, sped past our hiding place, heading towards the city buildings visible in the distance. The fleeting glimpse of the car with armed people in hazmat suits shattered any illusions of peaceful negotiations. It became clear these people were ready for a confrontation. Now another question tormented us. What had prompted them to leave their shelter? Had they noticed us when we were standing on the road, or was their departure due to their own needs? There was no answer. However, the display of firearms spoke for itself. They were clearly afraid of something, possibly the same threat that had forced us to seek shelter. Their caution only confirmed that the situation was far from calm. After a brief discussion, a decision quickly matured. We needed to hurry back to our temporary refuge to warn Leave and Deck. Now we knew for sure we were not alone here, and these people in white suits posed a clear danger. Trying not to attract attention, in short bursts, using natural cover, we moved back to the other end of Devnya towards our private sector. On the way back, we no longer encountered any trace of that car. Perhaps they hadn't even entered Devnya, but had headed somewhere else. An hour later, quite sweaty, we returned home. Liv and Deck looked noticeably better, although their faces still retained a sickly pallor. The medicine seemed to be working, but the growing sores on their skin were worrying. They didn't hurt, just itched and were unbearably irritating. Our self-proclaimed medic Deck was doing everything possible to help Liv and himself, using the meager supply of medicines and improvised means we had. We briefly outlined the results of our sortie to them. After discussion, we decided that all of us desperately needed a full rest today. We hoped that by tomorrow Deck would feel better, and then the three of us could attempt to hijack the car. We desperately needed it to get out of this cursed Devnya. We went to sleep early with a heavy premonition. What this night would bring was completely unclear. But the proximity of the dead last night left no doubt. They could discover our shelter as early as today. The silence of the house seemed deceptive, hiding potential danger around every corner. As night fell, the silence was broken by the growing roars and moans. Instantly, sleep receded. Our meager weapons were already placed by each boarded-up window, ready for battle. Deck looked surprisingly cheerful, which could not be said about Liv. She was shivering again. Her temperature had risen. Deck gave her an injection from our supplies. Now all that was left was to wait and hope. All night, their unliving movement raged outside, but to our amazement, they did not approach the house itself. Liv tossed and turned in delirium. She had a fever. It was unbearable to watch her suffering. Such longing, such helpless love rose in my heart. Each of her weak moans tore me apart from the inside. I prayed as best I could, but all my efforts to alleviate her suffering remained futile. Helplessness suffocated me, and my only desire was for her to come to her senses and for this nightmare to end. With the first rays of dawn, the fever subsided, and Liv fell into a deep, exhausted sleep. We also allowed ourselves a little rest. When the sun was already high, we woke up. Having no idea of the time, our phones had turned into bricks. To our surprise, Liv got up on her own and was even able to sit down and have breakfast with us, looking surprisingly normal. Deck was in excellent shape, but what Liv told us shocked us. She said that all night the dead had been talking to her, calling her to them. She and Deck had been bitten in that cursed cornfield. Strangely, they hadn't felt it, and now she and Deck were one of them and would soon join their ranks. She most likely wouldn't survive this night, and she would turn completely. Deck was next. Since he was stronger, it would take longer, but it was inevitable. The dead knew where we were hiding and were waiting for both of them to turn completely and open the door for them. She said that Finn and I had to run away from here immediately because the dead had said that none of us would ever leave this place. Deck confirmed that he had also heard these voices, but had taken them for a nightmare and hadn't paid attention. Finn and I tried to convince them that it was delirium and auditory hallucinations caused by the illness, but Liv and Deck insisted that it was impossible to see the same nightmare. The situation required immediate action. We urgently needed a car. Since everyone felt relatively well, we decided to head towards the chemical plant and decide what to do next on the spot. I firmly told Liv that I would never leave her, and we would get out of here together. We hastily packed our weapons into bags. Deck took a heavy, long pipe, and we set off. As soon as we approached the road, we heard the sound of an approaching car in the distance. We immediately crouched down in the roadside bushes, trying to blend in with the local vegetation. The car drove a little further, turning onto the very street where we had stopped on our first night. Carefully, in short bursts, we followed it in that direction.